Is the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV better than Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV? Well, let's find out by comparing the specs of both phones side by side. In the end, I will tell you which one I think is better and why. Let's get started with the design. The Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV measures 153mm in length, 67mm in width, and 8.3mm in thickness, while the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV measures 165mm in length, 71mm in width, and 8.2mm in thickness. In body size, the Xperia 1 Mark IV will appear slimmer to hold than the Xperia 10 Mark IV. The Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV weighs 161 grams lighter than the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV, which weighs 185 grams. Both the Xperia 10 Mark IV and Xperia 1 Mark IV support a single SIM with SD card or a dual SIM without SD card. The Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV and Xperia 10 Mark IV are dust and water resistant for up to 30 minutes. Looking at the display, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV has a 6.5 inches screen size, while the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV has a screen size of 6 inches. The Xperia 10 Mark IV has a screen resolution of 1080 by 2520 pixels display, while the Xperia 1 Mark IV has a screen resolution of 1644 by 3840 pixels. And the same refresh rate of 120 Hz. Both the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV and Xperia 1 Mark IV feature an OLED display type. The PPI density of the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV is 457 PPI, while the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV is 643 PPI. Both the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV and Xperia 1 Mark IV have a Corning Gorilla Glass protector. Please hit the subscribe button if you haven't done that. I will appreciate it if you do that. Performance-wise, the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV has up to 2.2 GHz processor, while the Xperia 1 Mark IV operates on an octa-core processor up to 3 GHz. The chipset on the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV is a Snapdragon 695 5G, while on Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV is a Snapdragon 8 Gen 1. Also, both phones run on Android 12. And the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV has an Adreno 619 graphics processing unit, while Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV has an Adreno 730 graphics processing unit. In terms of memory, the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV comes in 128GB of storage, while the Xperia 1 Mark IV comes in 256GB to 512GB of storage. Meanwhile, the maximum RAM in the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV is 6GB, and in the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV is a 12GB. Also, both phones have a memory card slot for expansion. Looking at the camera of both phones, the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV features a rear camera setup of a 12-megapixel wide-angle camera supported by an 8-megapixel ultra-wide-angle camera and another 8-megapixel telephoto camera. While the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV features a similar camera setup, a 12-megapixel wide-angle camera, supported by a 12-megapixel ultra-wide-angle camera, and a 12-megapixel telephoto camera with a 0.3-megapixel depth sensor. Looking at the video quality, the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV can shoot in 1080 at 30 frames per second, while the Xperia 1 Mark IV can shoot in 4K at 120 frames per second. Onto the front-facing camera of the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV is an 8-megapixel wide camera, while on the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV is a 12-megapixel wide camera. The Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV selfie camera can shoot in 1080p at 30 frames per second, while the Xperia 1 Mark IV selfie camera can shoot in 4K at 30 frames per second. Let's look at the battery capacity of both phones. The Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV and the Xperia 1 Mark IV are powered with a 5000 mAh battery. Meanwhile, the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV has a fast charging of 21 watts, and the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV has 30 watts fast charging. This means the Xperia 1 Mark IV will charge faster than the Xperia 10 Mark IV Ultra. Also, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV supports fast wireless charging and reverse wireless charging, while the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV does not. Both phones feature a loudspeaker, wireless LAN, 5G connectivity, Bluetooth, GPS, and NFC, and a 3.5 headphone jack. Overall, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV beats the Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV in the comparison score. In my opinion, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV beats the Xperia 10 Mark IV in performance, 4K video capability, and memory since it has up to 12GB RAM. However, both phones are excellent. Which do you think is better for you? Leave your thoughts in the comments section and don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Thank you.